Good afternoon. Welcome to today's edition of the Coal Scene. I'm Chris Hamilton, and I'll be your host over the next half hour. I want to initially thank the Library Television Network for sponsoring today's show, and every show for that matter. But with me in the studio today is Jason Bostic with the Coal Association. And we're going to be talking about some of the current events going on within the industry. Going to talk about some of the current up-to-date production and job numbers that we have, and Jason's also going to give us a glimpse of what we would likely expect throughout the remainder of the year concerning the status of coal and whether we expect to see any growth within the industry. So with that, Jason, thanks so much for taking the time to come by, and appreciate you, as we always do, to keep us informed on what's going on within the industry.
Thank you. Chris, appreciate being here.
Yeah, well, maybe a good place to start here is just to reflect over maybe the last quarter of 2017 and what we've experienced so far here as we near the end of the first quarter 2018. I know there's been a little bit of growth within the industry that's been sustained, for the biggest part of last 6 months or so, and hopefully we can, after the years we've had of a downturn, hopefully we can sustain that growth going forward. So with that, you sort of have an open mic here to tell us what you think's going on and what we might expect.
Okay. Well, Chris, as you mentioned, if you look back, 2017 is a year. The coal production levels in West Virginia went up substantially. We're up about 10 million tons from about 83 million in 2016, which is one of our record lows, as you know. We increased production about 10 to 12 million based on final production reports, which are still coming in, final production estimates. And when you look at the growth in the industry, first let me say that we were relieved to have it. Obviously, after 8 years of just an absolute nightmare of layoffs and mine closures, the industry appears through 2017 to have stabilized, and we've actually increased production 10 to 12 million tons. But if you look at the destination of the coal, where it was destined, where it was going, and what it was being used for, almost 100% of that increase was largely attributable to export markets. We as a state and a nation as a whole, exporting a great deal of thermal coal, steam coal for electrical generation into Europe, and at levels that we hadn't seen in decades. Again, thankful for that. But one of the disturbing things when you look at domestic consumption of coal within this country, the thermal coal consumption for West Virginia production actually dropped. It dropped by about 200,000 tons. And I think that continues to reflect the reduced market demand for coal in this country because of the massive amount of plant closures that have occurred over the last 9 to 10 years. And because of the plant closures, the market for coal continues to shrink. So we in West Virginia find ourselves competing at the remaining coal-fired power plants with cheaper coal from other regions and other basins. So while, again, the production's up, we were relieved to see that. The state was relieved, I think, from a revenue standpoint. And obviously, any day we can hire folks and put them back to work, that's a good day. But the sustainability of the export market is concerning. That's largely beyond our control. The amount of coal that Europe needs to import to produce its electricity is, that's a geopolitical force. That's completely beyond our control. That could change overnight. If the politics around the globe, the politics and the exchanges between Europe and the Ukraine, or Europe, the Ukraine, and Russia stabilize, then there might be a drop-off in demand for coal. And most of the coal exported from the United States, as you know, comes from West Virginia because it is the highest quality coal, and we're located relatively close to the ports. In addition to the steam coal exports, we also saw a pretty substantial jump in metallurgical coal exports for steelmaking. And a lot of that went to our traditional markets like Brazil and Japan, but there was an increase again in Europe. Its imports of metallurgical coal, which I think is reflective of the overall recovering global economy. When Europe needs metallurgical coal from this country, that's a good sign that the global economic recovery might be taking hold and might have some sustainability to it.
I think I think based on something I read here recently, Europe's in the process of shutting down some of its nuclear power facilities, and coal's being relied upon to fill the void left by the retirement of some of those nuke plants that have been operating for 30, 35 years.
Yes. After the Fukushima nuclear incident in Japan, I think France and Germany and some of the European Union nations took a hard look at their nuclear fleet. And I think their goal, Europe's goal, especially with respect to Germany and France, was to make the transition to the green energy grid or the green economy. That didn't work out as well as they planned. Windmills and solar panels aren't nearly as a reliable source of energy as a coal-fired power plant or a nuclear plant for that matter. So I think those countries found themselves short when it came time to produce energy for their citizens.
I've used the expression before that when you think of West Virginia coal, you can divide our output into thirds, where we, you know, of the total volume that we produce, we consume as a state about a third of that overall production, and we also transport or ship another third to 20-some neighboring states, all of which are east of the Mississippi River. And a majority of that is steam coal, but there's also some metallurgical coal within those shipments. And then we export about a third, and that number fluctuates obviously, but the good news with the exports is U.S. exports, as you well know, U.S. exports increase. You know, West Virginia accounts for about 1 out of every 2 tons of coal that leaves the U.S. borders. And we ship that coal, 37, 38 foreign destinations.
Yes, yes, in various quantities. And one of the things that we've seen recently, 2017, and looks to be sustainable through the first half of 2018, is the increase not only in thermal coal shipments to Europe, but thermal coal shipments to Asia, the developing nations of Asia. You know, they're no stranger to our metallurgical coal supplies. Obviously, Japan's been one of our top steel-making customers for a long time. But Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia are starting to import growing amounts of our thermal coal. And I think with respect to Japan especially, that is reflective of their assessment of their nuclear capacity after Fukushima. And I think Japan has set itself on a course or on a path to build some of the newest, cleanest, most modern coal-fired power plants in the globe, or around the globe, for that reason. And West Virginia coal, because of its high BTU, relatively low sulfur content, stands to be the fuel of choice for those power plants, I expect.
You know, with the advent of you know, the world becoming computerized, more and more companies are competing in a global economy. The coal industry's always competed in the global marketplace. And in that marketplace, we compete with a lot of other countries that mine a lot of coal. Australia, for instance, I think is one of the largest, based on something I read, appears to be the largest export of metallurgical coal.
Yes, yes. Australia's metallurgical coal just about mirrors West Virginia's. You know, we say often that we have the best metallurgical coal in the world, and we do. Australia's metallurgical coal is very, very similar to ours, and being as close as it is to the developing markets of China and India, it's the first stop if you need metallurgical coal in that region. But when the world economy is in good health and steel production around the world is not, I'm not going to say booming, but is active, then the supply from Australia is usually soaked up by those Asian countries. So that takes it off of the seaborne market, so it's unable to get to Europe or get to South America.
And I think most foreign countries, not all, but a lot of your larger foreign countries like to have multiple sources of coal supplies, just like all of our power plants here in the U.S. and within West Virginia. You know, don't want to be held, I hate using the word captive, but they don't want to be held captive to one operation, to where they, you know, they fail or sail based on, you know, the fortunes of that one operation. Foreign destinations and foreign countries look at coal supplies in a similar way.
Absolutely.
You know, they don't want to be held captive to one supplier, one country. So often they'll, And I think that's where we supply a little bit of a niche, have a little bit of a niche market. They look to U.S. Supplement or enhance some of the major other suppliers.
They do, Chris, and because we have multiple export points, multiple ports on the eastern seaboard that can take eastern coal shipments by rail primarily and transload it to ocean-going vessels, we are less susceptible to weather interruptions. The Australian export infrastructure is extremely vulnerable to weather disruption. And the price fluctuations that you see in metallurgical coal, the sudden spikes, are usually caused by some extreme weather event in Australia. It's limited the ability to load trains or to move the trains or to have the ships loaded at the export points.
I read somewhere where most of the areas that are more prone to have mining also have very severe weather patterns to where they almost have monsoons, typhoons, just that not only impact the day-to-day operations, but could have almost catastrophic, like hurricane impacts on the infrastructure and the ability to load and ship coal as well from the country.
Yeah. Australia has a great deal of that. I wouldn't say on a day-to-day basis, but every 3 to 4 months it seems like there's a severe weather event that disrupts the shipments.
And their a misfortune results in an opportunity for countries like ours,
Yes.
that fill that void.
Mm-hmm.
Domestically, you mentioned that we've seen a reduced market. I don't think there's any secret about that today. After we went through the 8 years of the last presidential administration and the efforts of EPA to ratchet down or reduce the amount of coal that's consumed in the country. With that, we saw the closure of a number of coal-fired power plants. And based on cost implications, it's unlikely we're going to see new coal-fired plants to replace the ones that have been retired or those that have announced retirements for this year and next year. Mm-hmm. So with that comes a a much smaller market domestically, and we're seeing expansion of renewables, gas or solar and and wind power. And we're also seeing this expansion of natural gas that comes from the shale gas deposits that we found, Marcellus and Utica.
Yes.
There's a couple others, but so with that we have a shrinking market, but yet you have all this capacity from renewables, gas competing with coal, obviously having an impact there.
Yes, and if you look, Chris, that trend continued last year, although we are through the majority of the plant closures that were brought about by EPA under the Obama administration, the 600 units at the 400 plants. I think there's 30 more units scheduled to go offline to comply with those regulations. But we're through that for the most part, but with that came a reduction in demand. And more importantly, all the power plants that remain in this country can burn coal from any region or any state. That wasn't necessarily true before those regulations were implemented. You have certain power plants that didn't have scrubber technology that had to burn low sulfur coal. West Virginia and Wyoming being the choices for that type of coal. Now that the power plants can burn anything, we find ourselves in West Virginia competing with actually lower quality coal because the power plants can consume it. And on a cost per ton basis, it winds up being cheaper than West Virginia coal, primarily because of government imposition. We have certain taxes and fees in West Virginia that don't exist in other states. And we also have a level of transportation disadvantage. Most of our mines are railroad bound. We can only ship coal by rail. Or we can, even if we can have access to other transportation modes, part of that transportation has to occur by rail. So limited capacity with respect to transportation. Some of the other coal regions like Illinois and Indiana have direct access to river transportation, which is much cheaper.
One of the things that leaves most people with the impression that we're doing a little better as an industry than what we experienced 2 years ago or 3 years ago. People are reporting coal train sightings or hearing trains running again in areas where, where that was, just very quiet. As people are seeing coal trucks moving. People are seeing increased barge traffic. So it's interesting how that all comes together.
Yeah.
They noticed they noticed the lack of coal trucks. They noticed the fewer trains. It's amazing how people monitor that in local communities in southern West Virginia.
It is, and for the most part, as you know, as mining occurs out of sight. We're either underground, obviously, or we're back at the top of the mountain, at the very head of the hollow, outside of, for the most part, public scrutiny, just because of the isolation of the operation. So what people do see are the barges, the trucks, and the trains. And with the 10 to 12 million ton increase, we've obviously seen a corresponding increase in railroad traffic.
Yeah.
Primarily.
So the benchmark that's used is about 160 million tons, which is what we mined as a state, and probably averaged, for the first part of the new millennium through the 1990s, probably averaged about 165 million tons of annual production. And we saw that reduced, cut in half, basically, down to 80 million tons or thereabouts. We also saw the workforce drop from 25,000 direct mining jobs to 12 or 13,000, I believe, 2016.
Yeah, well, we hit a low of about 8,000. And we've gone back up in 2017, in the first part of 2018, to about 12, 13,000. Which again, that's a relief. Most of those additions have been where we lost the most, which was in southern West Virginia. And the expansion in southern West Virginia has been primarily metallurgical driven. It's high quality metallurgical coal that's filling not only the worldwide demand for steel making, but also an uptick in domestic steel production, which is not only a good sign for West Virginia, but I think it's a good sign for the country.
So you can compete with coal as a base fuel for electricity generation, and even replace to some extent with wind, with natural gas. But when it comes to steel making, there's no replacement for high-grade metallurgical coal.
That's right. There is no other way to produce steel. It takes a percentage of coal that is coked by the steel companies to produce a pure carbon product that has to be fed into the blast furnace to produce raw iron.
And we have one coking facility in the state, up in the northern part of the state.
At Follansbee, we still have Mountain State Carbon. It's a battery of coke ovens that has the most up-to-date pollution
Now, I know where
control.
Follansbee is. It's north of the Mason-Dixon line.
It's pretty far up north.
It's actually north of Pittsburgh, but it's in the clear tip of the Panhandle. It's an amazing operation. It actually adjoins parts of the old Weirton Steel. And of course, a lot of that's been shut down. But to see a coke plant sitting up there, and I just happened to have been in the area a few weeks ago, and it's an amazing facility.
Yeah, they are.
It really is.
It's an amazing process to watch.
What's going on with steel production?
Because ever since the election, coincidental to the election of the president, or the federal election, there was a general uptick in steel production in this country, raw steel, raw iron production. And over the coming months, or over the last few months of his presidency, especially with the announcement of tariffs on imported steel, you had the larger of the American steel producers make announcements to restart idled blast furnaces or restart major steel production lines. So I think we are going to see an increase in domestic steel production, not only because of the announcement, the tariff announcement, but I think some of the infrastructure plans that the president intends to put in place will obviously require a good deal of high-quality American steel for infrastructure construction.
Something tells me that the whole scheme of setting tariffs here, as we've seen the president do, needs to play out a little more, and may have some, it just may be an item that's discussed and maybe even modified some going forward, because you're beginning to hear, the possibility of other countries setting tariffs on imports. We sell a lot of equipment. We have a lot of major equipment manufacturers here in the U.S. that sell equipment and supply, foreign countries with a lot of heavy equipment, dozers, a lot of earth moving type machinery, and we send the metallurgical coal to foreign destinations to be, to be processed and used for steel production. So it's a double-edged sword.
It really is, because as you know, we export more metallurgical coal around the globe than we ship to domestic steel facilities. So it really does have the potential to cut both ways. But I do think overall, increasing domestic steel production, which would increase domestic coal demand, that will largely single out the state of West Virginia. When it comes to metallurgical coal here in this country, it really is just West Virginia, a little bit of Alabama, some of Pennsylvania, but the majority of that coal production comes from here.
Yeah, and I just think it's the whole issue, protectionism and all, it raises some concern, but especially when you're a major export state like we are, but just something we got to look at and watch very closely, and maybe participate in the tweaking of that, going forward.
And I think, Chris, we also have to consider the aluminum tariffs. Even though aluminum, you don't have to use coal directly in the aluminum process or the aluminum refining and forging process, aluminum smelters are very, very high quantity electricity users. The electric furnaces consume a lot of power, and in the past that has been primarily coal-fired electrical generation because of where the facilities were located and the demand for so much electricity. So if a couple of aluminum smelters, particularly in the eastern half of the United States, increase production or restart, that's going to increase electrical demand. And with some coal-fired capacity that's probably not being used to its full capability, that could also result in increased market for us.
I plug our electric utility neighbors and friends every chance I can, because they've done a remarkable job within the state of West Virginia, within our marketing territory, upgrading these plants. They're all some of the cleanest burning plants you'll find in the country, and most likely the world, because I think we are the pace setters or leaders in that regard. We've doubled, tripled the use of coal over the past 25 years as a country, and we've reduced all particulates. You go by these power facilities today, whether it's a John Amos down here or the Mitchell up north, or any of the other 10 or 11 we have, and you see a water vapor coming out. And it's a large volume of steam and water vapor, but there's virtually zero contaminants within the airstream coming out of those plants.
That's exactly right. I mean, our two primary utilities in West Virginia spent somewhere around the order of about $3.8 billion to bring those plants up to spec with the EPA regulations issued under the Obama administration. So not only are our facilities in West Virginia some of the largest coal-fired power plants in the country, they are also among the cleanest. We don't have any plants that require further upgrade.
They all have scrubbers that I'm aware of, desulfurization units, and to remove the sulfur. They have low NOx burners. They have precipitators.
They have mercury control technology.
Mercury control technologies. I mean, there's just a whole array of environmental technical improvements that's been made, and it's increased the cost of electricity a little bit, but it's still very competitive when you look at it with what everybody else is paying around the country.
It is. We have gone, I think, from probably the second lowest cost electrical producer, cost of electricity in the country, to about the third or fourth. But we are still consistently lower than the majority of the rest of this country, and lower than our surrounding states, which are either, one, they're unregulated electrical markets, or they're two, extremely reliant on natural gas to produce electricity. And while there's a much larger quantity of natural gas available for electrical generation, because the natural gas market is influenced by other factors, home heating demand during peak winter time. The natural gas price fluctuates so wildly that power companies cannot sign long-term contracts for the delivery of natural gas at a set price. About 80 to 85% of the coal used at at electric generating plants in this country is sold under long-term contract. Only about 20% is traded under spot purchases, day to day, week to week, or month to month. Most of that coal is sold on multi-year contracts. Exactly the opposite is true for natural gas. Only 20% of the gas consumed by the power utility industry is sold under long-term contract. About 80 to 85% is sold day to day, week to week, month to month, which makes it extremely volatile for the electrical consumer. So, your power bill may be $50 one month, maybe $500 the next month, depending on natural gas demand, like we saw in the most recent winter storms. Natural gas prices increased in some areas as much as 300%.
The legislature over the past couple of years have enacted some real pro-jobs, pro-growth programs, which I think's had a positive effect on mining. And I heard the governor earlier today at the Expo, Contractors Expo program, talk about all the new jobs. We passed a road bond last October. And, based on the Duke University study, I think there's 40,000 new jobs going to be created in highway design, construction around the state over the next few years. There's been announcements, the Toyota plant and Hino Motors expanding, U.S. Methanol opening here. We got the Procter & Gamble, Kohl's doing a little better than it was. I mean, there's really reason to be optimistic. And, one asked, and it's a fair question, where are all the people going to come to fill these jobs? Seems like, and it's a good thing to have that question asked and to have that kind of a problem.
It absolutely is. And, obviously with the road construction, with the coal industry doing better, I'm hopeful that for some of the counties that were so badly impacted economically and socially by the layoffs in the coal industry, that some of that workforce gets reabsorbed by either the new jobs coming or the coal industry reopening operations.
Well, the job level and skills truly transferable, and it'd be real nice to see those individuals that were operating a dozer or a pan or heavy equipment in mining that were furloughed to be first in line, or to at least be considered for some of these new highway jobs.
Yep.
Well, we're gonna just about run out of time here. It's been very informative. Boy, that's just a real optimistic report. As we get into 2018 a little bit, we hope that all this increased production, new jobs can be sustained throughout the year. And just want to thank you so much for all you do and for coming by today. Want to thank you, and thank you for watching today's program. And thanks to the Library Television Network for sponsoring us today.